Anthony, welcome to the Evangelical Dark Web. Today we'll be discussing a real Christian response to Christian nationalism. So that is the topic that we're going to be discussing today. And there's been a lot of debate about this in the Big Eva community and the society at large. And the reasons for that are usually bad. I think the term is being both misused and mismaligned, if that makes sense. And we're going to be discussing a lot of that, doing a lot of discussion on that tonight. How are you doing?
Doing
Uh,
good.
you wrote a recent article about this that will be published. How about you describe what that is, what the article was called, and kind of some main ideas that you kind of bring out?
So the article is called "Defending the Rise of Christian Nationalism." Basically, the point is to be like an apologetic towards this idea, as well as kind of just confront it, because obviously, since the election or since the successful primary of Doug Mastriano, the term Christian nationalism has gained a lot of traction, both on the left and on the right. And I would certainly say it starts on the left because they kind of want to brand. This is their latest attempt to brand the Trump supporters, the MAGA crowd, because you can't call them racist forever. The term loses its luster. So, so I would certainly say it starts on the left, and then of course you have several on the right that kind of co-opt the term. Probably the most obvious would be like your Andrew Torbas or your like Marjorie Taylor Greene has kind of co-opted the term, and then naturally, like a lot of the people in the Big Eva crowd, the Never Trump crowd, are kind of just bashing the term, um, thinking it's a dangerous idea.
Now it's interesting that you tie Doug Mastriano to this because I wouldn't have guessed that he would have been the impetus for the rise of the term. I think a lot of people are, white nationalism has kind of lost its salt. And it's just so I think they just moved on to Christian nationalism because they're trying to get at the root of it.
I
Because
mean,
I guess there's a lot of not so white nationalists out there.
the earliest, or not say earliest, but like maybe within like recent years, I guess January 6th might have been the biggest propelling, the biggest impetus for the term kind of rising back into the lexicon. But you still have a lot of politicians that came out of like some of the January 6th stuff and the I guess the post 2020 election drama. And Doug Mastriano would be one of them because I believe he was actually at the Capitol or at the National Mall that day.
Okay, a lot of politicians were, and that's drawing some scrutiny, obviously. But nonetheless, we got a couple underlying events that kind of propelled this term to national usage. But obviously, there's a lot of things that people don't really know what they mean. So, how about we just first define, what is the evangelical dark web? I just think it's important to just be upfront about who we are and what we're really about, just because this is kind of going to be some evergreen content that we're doing that will be used as a reference moving forward on this issue. So, who is the Evangelical Dark Web? Well, that's the ministry that I started. You've hopped on to. Um, and it started out as discernment. I really wanted to tackle false gospels. Three false gospels that I specifically set out to tackle would be the prosperity gospel, the social justice gospel, and then the popularity gospel, which is what I called, which was more about megachurch culture. And I think it kind of undermined the gospel. Jesus saves us from our messiness. So those were three things that I set out to do. And another thing that I wanted to do was do more in-depth research on false teachers or potential false teachers. And by potential, I mean it was at reader request. They're giving me names to look up and just do some research. What can I find? And it kind of became about that. But we're also going to have more objective standards. And when we do discernment, it's not just going to be arbitrary on a whim, I should say. There's going to be like a standard of what constitutes um, someone being a false teacher, what actually does it? It's not just a sectarian difference between, say, Reformed Presbyterianism and Trad Baptist. So we need something deeper than that, and because that term was very false, because there wasn't any middle ground between people doing discernment on people like Joel Osteen. You see a lot of uh, in-depth research on someone like Joel Osteen, but you'd see nothing on up-and-comers, or you'd see entire lists of false teachers just by name, no other information provided. So we needed some kind of do a middle ground there where we had more names but more research. So that's kind of where it started. But what Evangelical Dark Web has become is more of a Christian news gathering and commentary organization and ministry. Now, it's not to say that we're a 501c3 charity, because we're not, but this is nonetheless a ministry. It is active in spiritual warfare. And that's really what this is, because spiritual warfare is, a cosmic level warfare. And in this cosmic level warfare, there's a fog of war that we on the ground have. God knows what's going on. God knows what's going on. He's everywhere, all powerful, all at once. But we don't. So we need information in order to prayerfully act, in order to biblically act. And that's what we're doing. We're providing information so that Christians can act biblically. Otherwise, they might act biblically on bad information, which will have a bad result, or they act unbiblically off good information, which could happen. But obviously, there's a need for clarity in the fog of spiritual warfare that we're seeing. We need discernment in spiritual warfare. So that is what Evangelical Dark Web has really become since I've started out doing it. And I see that the live stream is picking up. So if you have chats, send them in. We'll address questions as we continue to the night, because we love interacting with chat here on the Evangelical Dark Web. Otherwise, let's start out with some terms. So the first term to start out with is the most obvious one. What is a Christian?
No, so still kind of loaded.
Right.
But
It is loaded. Like, obviously, there's someone who is part of Jesus's chosen elect. That is probably your most standard definition of what a Christian is. But is there a possibility that Christian could also be an adjective to describe not a person, which would be a noun, a Christian would be a noun, but an idea or even a culture? Does that fall into does the term Christian become so expansive in that regard that it can describe things that are good, objectively good?
I mean, I feel like it would have to some extent. I mean, we talk about like maybe Romans 14 with like Christian liberty. So this idea that you have certain, um, I guess I'll say rights, but certain liberties that you can exercise based on conscience, matters of conscience. So that would be like the whether to eat kosher or not, to some
So
extent.
the basis for Christian liberty is your basis for using Christian as sort of an adjective to describe an idea. So Christian liberty being the choice between doing two things that are good, or even two things that are morally neutral but within the bounds of God's law.
Yeah. So I mean, there is some, I guess, basis for using, I guess, Christian as an adjective.
More
I mean,
broadly than just saying strictly the person who is saved.
yeah. I mean, we could also say Christian king. Um, Obviously, they might like if you go through Roman history, they might say the Christian emperors,
Right.
even though
There's the
they might
Christian
not
emperors and the
be.
pagan emperors, despite.
So there is a distinction,
Yeah.
even if they weren't saved, like a Constantine probably wasn't.
Right.
Um, so I mean, there is some history, and of course, you have to look at how the language uses the term, not necessarily how, um, not necessarily how we as the church uses the term. Because again, part of the whole use of Christian nationalism is what does it mean versus what do the individual words mean, which I guess we're parsing through right
Right.
now. But
And I just got a question in the chat, which will actually line up quite well with where we're at in the stream, is explaining what the Jerusalem cross behind you. Elaborate on what it means to the dark web while we're defining our terms. So, evangelical dark web, I didn't actually define the etymology of the term. Evangelical dark web, like Christian nationalist, was used as a pejorative to describe dissidents on the internet. Intellectual dark web was, dissidents on the internet. It was kind of like more your Joe Rogan types, even though none of the evangelical dark web were really anything to the right of a normie con like Ben Shapiro. So no one was really to the right of Ben Shapiro on the intellectual dark web list. But then someone like some Fed went on around the big EVA circuit talking about evangelical dark web, and they're so afraid of the evangelical dark web and it's going to lead to extremism that I kind of co-opted the label and turned it into a ministry name because the domain was available for building a website. Yes, that's simple. So the Jerusalem cross, the history of the Jerusalem cross, I think it's also called, there's another name to it as well, but it was the cross of the Crusaders. And the Crusaders went and conquered the Holy Land during the First Crusade and established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which lasted around 200 years in a various form. And, uh, you know, in my opinion, the Kingdom of Jerusalem is more aspirational than the modern nation state of Israel. That was them trying to retake the Holy Land from the Muslims in a military revanchist expedition. It was also trying to retake it. It initially started out as trying to retake the Holy Land for the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, but they had some falling outs on the way. But very interesting history. Uh, and I think there's some more aspirational of trying to fight the fight in spiritual warfare, specifically when spiritual warfare at that time was a lot more militaristic. The Muslims had the convert or jizya mentality, and they had taken a lot of European ground or a lot of Christian ground because the
well,
conquest started out strictly religious, and that, or they used religion as a means of gaining a casus belli. Is that the correct Latin for that? A justification for war. They used religion as a justification for war, and these people wouldn't convert to Islam, so we're going to declare war on them. So this is about reclaiming and re-advancing God's kingdom, because we can say all we want that the church thrives under persecution, and then when these areas have been persecuted for centuries on centuries, and there's very little church there, to where centuries later it's still underground, that argument kind of falls apart.
I mean, I don't know if
Or it's
anyone,
cherry picked. It's historically cherry picked.
I don't know if anyone's saying the church in Saudi Arabia has thrived for hundreds of years. It's
Right.
probably been steady,
I
maybe.
mean, the church in China is still younger than the church was in Rome when Christianity became the dominant religion in Rome. Church in Japan uh, was pretty much stunted by harsh persecution. So there is a misconception that if persecution happens, the church will always thrive. Now, God's kingdom will prevail, but doesn't mean it will prevail everywhere in every area. Uh, Other than the fact that God is still sovereign in everywhere in every area. So that's a little bit of history for you. We get a lot of esoteric history here on the evangelical dark web. But in defining terms, I think the next term to define is nationalism, which I actually think is the easiest term to define.
I mean, I mean, within the context of the debate, it looks like nationalism could essentially be swapped out for patriotism. It's just the word nationalism probably has more militant connotations attached to it, because Christian nationalism, in a sense, is not jingoistic, as most people that are self-described Christian nationalists are actually anti-war. They view the endless wars as mistakes. They view donating to Ukraine as a mistake. and a wasted effort. So I mean, a lot of these people are not jingoistic. They don't want to see America be the world police. So nationalism can probably just be defined as a degree of love for a country. Um,
You see, there's another component to the definition of nationalism that no one really talks about, and that's juxtaposing because nationalism is in the middle. There are, if there are three orientations, you have localism, which would mean you favor very, very localized government, and perhaps even a subcategory of that is provincialism. Then you have nationalism. Then you have globalism. So most of the debate in the United States, in public sphere, is between nationalism and globalism. And that's really where the debate is. So when you have something like Christian nationalism, you're really just adding Christian to an already fixated position. And another thing that no one really talks about with nationalism is that it's a beta ideology. So, what do I mean by a beta ideology? Is that this ideology means nothing unless it's attached to another ideology. Because it means nothing to say that you're a nationalist and then you don't know what nation that they're a nationalist of.
big difference between I'm a Chinese nationalist for the CCP versus I'm I guess American nationalist.
Right. There's an outstanding difference between someone who's uh, is a nationalist from two extremely different countries. Now, you're seeing in Europe nationalism starting to look the same. It is starting to look like, hey, we don't want to bring in immigrants from other countries to dilute our population. That's kind of what nationalism is looking like in a lot of other European countries. But that's because they're extremely juxtaposed between World Economic Forum globalism. So that's largely the debate that's happening in other countries. America nationalism has a lot more to do with non-interventionalism, which is a American tradition of not interfering in European wars, and
The other thing is it's kind.
protectionist trade policy as well.
Yeah, I mean, America First could pretty much, again, you could replace American national or Christian nationalism with American First for
I don't
majority of the cases.
I don't necessarily think that's entirely true. I think there are a few more domestic issues where America First and nationalist would disagree, but the overlap is so overwhelming that these two ideologies are taking over the Republican Party. And that's evident in Kerry Lake, very America First candidate. That's evident in Doug Mastriano, very Christian nationalist candidate. Both would get the support of the American First movement. Donald Trump as well. And Donald Trump, I guess we'll talk more about him later in the stream if we have time. But again, he would also represent, to some degree, the America First movement, which has been transactionally used by a budding Christian nationalist movement. And by budding, I mean like we are just beginning to really explore the limits or capabilities of Christians getting involved severely in politics. And I mean severely as in we are turning the dial up multiple levels. It was on maybe a 2 prior to Trump. We need to get that up to like an 8, maybe.
11.
Yeah, Spinal Tap, 11. So there's a lot. There's a lot to do. So when we put the two terms together, what do you think that means?
I mean, again, I'll use like Christian patriotism, basically the idea. I mean, one, it's a recognition of America's Christian heritage, going back to the Pilgrims, the Mayflower Compact, this notion of the city on a hill as being something to aspire to, which has been used through. I mean, we'll probably talk about that later, but
Now we can talk about that
the
now.
the idea of being the city on a hill, which comes from Matthew 5:14. So basically says Jesus says a city on a hill cannot be hidden. A light um, city on a hill cannot be hidden. So and this has been an idea, I want to say it goes back to Augustine, but within American politics, it begins with John Winthrop. So that, you know, before the Pilgrims set off, he did a model for Christian charity. Let me actually,
So
and then yeah, he did a model for Christian charity, and then of course several presidents have used this notion throughout the era, including
okay,
JFK,
you're cutting
Ronald.
you're cutting out. So let me just butt in for a second while you fix your internet. But when I put the terms together, I want to focus on this question: what is an ambassador? And so this kind of redefines the terms because the Bible calls us ambassadors of Christ. So, and that makes us ambassadors. So what is an ambassador? An ambassador is a foreign emissary that comes to a country to do the agenda of the country that they are serving, and that's the foreign country. And that foreign country is God's kingdom. It's the heavenly kingdom. Christ says that is the kingdom that is not of this world, but the kingdom is nonetheless going to be in this world, uh, because Christ comes first as a savior, and then he'll come as a conqueror. So this idea needs to be strictly captured in the way Christians view politics. We are ambassadors. That means when we are in this country, we are serving the agenda of God's kingdom, of the heavenly kingdom. That is the nation that we are to be nationalist of. And an ambassador is a political position, and the ambassador is, theoretically, the head diplomat, the person who's at the head of the mission in a foreign land. So there's power in being an ambassador. We're not just diplomats here. We are to carry out the agenda of Christ. And that's the purpose. So and that's the nation that we are nationalist of. And in doing so, when we put Christian and nationalists together, we are serving Christ's kingdom here on earth, and we're advancing the kingdom of heaven and its agenda. And that agenda includes the Great Commission. That agenda includes doing good works here on earth. So there's a lot of things that fall under this agenda. So when you tie that back to the Pilgrims and their view of the historical founding, I'll let you take over from here.
Yeah, so I mean the Pilgrims. I mean, if you look at them like theologically, I mean you're talking post millennial and Reformed versus like a lot of the Catholics and some of the other Protestant sects at the time. So what you'll f- what they thought that they were doing was if they would form a Christian nation, then that would fulfill what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount about being a city on a hill or a lamp to the world, that you could not be ignored. And within within American history, we've always kind of designated ourselves as this great experiment because no one had ever founded a nation based on I guess more of a philosophical framework versus nations were initially defined by borders, by their patriarch, by their ethnic breakup or their shared culture or language, and America basically kind of breaks this framework. And you see this like in some of the founding fathers with the Great American Experiment, and like how that how that language flows through. Obviously, when they're trying to sell the Federalist Papers to the American people, they're basically saying, "Hey, we've seen what works and what doesn't work in other nations." Because the first, like, I guess, 15 to 20 Federalist Papers generally deal with um, what the status quo is. They might talk about some like conflicts in like obscure, well, I won't say obscure, but obscure conflicts like stuff that happened in Belgium that they don't really teach in
Yeah,
American
a lot
history.
of stuff, a lot of history in the Dutch Netherlands that really influences the United States, specifically because the Dutch had a republic, and I believe the story is that they hung the DeWitt brothers on a lamppost. I believe that's the history, and then they went back to having a king. That was somewhat related to the English king. So those two nations were cool once again because they had a brief conflict. So
And
yeah, a
then
lot of
and this kind of does continue when like because you have the American Revolution and it works, and then you have the French Revolution which doesn't work, and then you'll eventually have Alexander de Tocqueville who comes over to America to basically say explore why did this work out versus why did the French Revolution fail. That was I mean, and he wrote a lot on the subject.
yeah. So I think let's kind of jump into what do others say Christian nationalism is. So
So
there's two categories of others: liberal media and Big Eva. And yes, there is a lot of overlap when you have things like the Christianity Today or Compromise Today, as I like to call it. A lot of overlap between liberal media and Big Eva.
so basically the article was broken down into two distinct categories. I kind of break it down into what does the liberal media say, and for this I use the New York Times, their reporter Elizabeth Diaz, who I believe actually did an article on Apologia Church and abortion now. So she actually did that an article on them. So it's kind of coincidental that she does one on Christian nationalism. And you know, I guess to her credit, Apologia did have good things to say about her when she wrote her article, even though there was disagreement. So she defines it. So the way she defines it, because you got to understand, even though she's a liberal, she's going to have her spin on it. She's going to have a lot of her inherent presuppositions. But at the same time, you kind of see, okay, this is the liberals are kind of just cracking open their playbook, and the way they kind of do it is they try to paint it more as a fringe movement versus something that's more mainstream. Basically,
And yeah, it's funny is the beauty of social media is that it convinces people that fringe ideologies are actually more widely held. And then it also convinces people that uh, widely held ideologies are actually fringe. So there's kind of like a reverse play in social media. But continue with how does she define it other than
so
just being fringe?
so her definition mainly points to especially their rise coincides with significant backing of like-minded grassroots supporters, especially as some voters and politicians blend their Christian faith with election fraud conspiracy theories, QAnon ideologies, gun rights, and lingering anger over COVID-related restrictions. So she kind of boils it down into four distinct categories, though she will pretty much add replacement theory into the as like a fifth category. And of course, you know, obviously she's
Except
being
when
liberal,
replacement theory is being celebrated by the media.
indeed. And it's like she unironically references replacement theory as a conspiracy while also referencing the impact of replacement theory on American demographics. But she basically boils it down to conspiracy, guns, anger, and Christianity as like the four things that concoct into Christian
Conspiracy,
nationalism.
guns, Christianity, and what?
Anger.
Anger. Okay. So she has like a four Christian nationalist quadrilateral, if you get that
Pretty much.
reference. If the evangelical quadrilateral, which is just a nonsensical uh, concept to invite people into a circle that they don't belong to. Uh, but just to kind of go off of that, like, first of all, like, I don't get the ties between, like, we ran a campaign and we ran a political campaign, talked to a lot of conservatives. Did you ever come across one QAnon person?
I mean, I guess it just depends on what you define as QAnon. Obviously, you know, people
I,
believe people, you know, they I guess are concerned about sex cults and things like that, but and pedophiles and pedophilia, sex trafficking, things like that. But you know, we know that these things do exist, even if there's no
uh,
satanic cultic element to it.
And
Um,
just for the record, I wrote against QAnon basically back in 2017, 2018. So before most of the church or before Big Eva was jumping on the topic of QAnon, I had already written against it. And it's because the theory wasn't true. They were just lying. And then once the theory was kind of losing steam, they jumped on the issue of sex trafficking.
I mean, I think the
They jumped
biggest
on that issue. They did not start out on that issue. They started out on Hillary's emails being indicted and secret indictments, and then Jeff Sessions is going to indict all these traitors to Trump. That's what QAnon started out as. And
I
then
mean, I
they
think
hopped on the child sex abuse or child sex trafficking bandwagon because of Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself. And that's maybe where they caught enough steam to get the attention of Big Eva. So,
I
but
think the
they
biggest
got debunked.
Q theory
And
that you kind of see out there now is just this whole Trump reinstatement thing, which is just a giant canard, or just these people out there. I guess they're kind of more nihilist than Christian, but um,
I mean,
basically there's this global plan, and that Trump. I saw one dude spouting about how Trump lost on purpose. So I mean, you get a couple of crazies out there. Though here's a money line from the article. Um, While the satanic cults are unconfirmed, there are sex trafficking rings, which the left acknowledges whenever they attempt to associate Jeffrey Epstein with Donald Trump. So if a leftist ever says there's no sex trafficking, then ask them
then
why
what
they
does it
try to
matter? Yeah, why did they try to
why does
paint
it
Trump to
matter
Epstein,
whether yeah.
which has significantly weaker ties than Bill Clinton or most other Democrats, because there's like a public falling out between those two before he was arrested for anything. Uh,
But the
so
left but
she
the left
defined it as a quadrilateral.
pretty much you could say that. Um, and of course, obviously, like she'll talk about how, separation of church and state's an American ideal, abortion's a right. Like again, that's what she thinks. That's kind of what you would expect a liberal to
Right.
say.
Even though
But
none
sh
of those things are true, but yes.
but her
Uh,
big thing is kind of trying to paint it as a fringe movement because in her article she details a bunch of like failed candidates, the most notorious of which would be Candace Taylor down in Georgia, who's failed and
but
bad.
her agenda of destroying the Georgia Guidestones succeeded.
Yeah, she got one victory.
She got one victory. She lost the battle, but won the war. But QAnon. I know I just said that social media can convince people that fringe ideologies are widespread, and that's QAnon to a T. Like that's what social media did with QAnon. It convinced people that it was far more widespread than it actually was. I mean, yes, there are pictures everywhere of like Q-tards, but those people don't, I've met more crazy people that weren't QAnon on campaign trails than I have met QAnon people, because I don't remember any QAnon people. So
One thing she actually does go into, which I mean, I don't think the Big Eva type gets into it, or at least I don't want to buy his book to find out how much he gets into it, is what the
and the
Christian
Big Eva
National
type is who?
Paul Miller.
Paul Miller.
So like she talks about how a lot of their agenda focuses on the abortion, which again she'll consider a right. School, like she cites a lot of the Supreme Court victories as the recent Supreme Court victories as giving momentum to Christian nationalism. So that's one thing she talks about, and then she
Which it
talks about
does.
the Florida the Florida
Stop
parental
woke.
rights and parental rights in educations, or don't say gay as it was derisively called. And then the last one she cites is Texas treating transgendering children as child abuse. So she cites that. So these are just the examples of what the Christian nationalist agenda is to her and how it's impacting American society today. So again, she's trying to probably paint this more as a fringe movement because, normal people don't want to end abortion.
Normal
Um,
people want to transgender their children.
exactly.
Just,
So by basically painting it as fringe, as people imposing their religion on to society, which again, she's basically still trying to impose hers on society,
so,
which
how does Big Eva define Christian nationalism?
um,
He had Christianity or compromise today, as I like to call them. And if I recall, I actually agree, or I didn't agree with their definition of the term per se, but I assented to its meaning, or it as a political movement. I dissent to.
well, it's funny they don't. always, it's like they can kind of define it, but they'll still like disagree with it because it pretty much goes against their political
Yeah,
leanings.
right. Because I can't remember the name. Like Timothy Dalrymple or whatever his name is like a hardcore lib. But I believe they defined it as believing that America has a Christian heritage, and that heritage should be maintained. Like that's the gist of how Christianity today or compromise today define Christian nationalism.
And you might have actually been reading. I mean, he had an article on Christian nationalism, like um, it would have been after January 6th, but he did have one on that. But I mean, the person I cite as like our big Eva face is Paul Miller, who basically is a former foreign policy consultant in the Bush administration. He's currently on the book tour right now, or as I like to call the Griff Circuit, because he basically wrote a book called The Religion of American Greatness, What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism, which, and then if you look into his background, obviously he served in the military, he was in the CIA, and he was in the latter years of the Bush administration, which I think is like 2007 to 2009. And politically, he is a war hawk and is a rampant never Trumper. Which I mean, you look through his tweets, and yeah, there's a lot of Trump hate there going on there, which I think is a lot of the impetus for this book. Where Big Eva's, again, it looks like in the excerpt I quote. I mean, I only quote part of it, but the beginning of the excerpt seems to paint is kind of just doing the whole evangelical voter Trump worship line, which you've kind of seen for years from the
I
whole.
mean, if anything, it was. If anything, I think it really showed that most evangelicals grasped that they were using Trump to accomplish their agenda.
Yeah, I
It's
mean,
just so painfully obvious. But people like David French know so much more than we do.
and
And
that's
I don't know if you
pretty
saw.
much.
I don't know if you saw the latest David French, the David Frenchism. Let me just pull it up.
Please do, because I mean, I feel like I think he
Okay.
writes behind the paywall. So
Government/big tech collusion to censor political speech is the blessing of liberty.
he actually said that.
That's the general trend because he was attacking Ron DeSantis and his anti-censorship bill being blocked by courts. And he's like, they're attacking free speech, and he's calling it an attack on the First Amendment. But you don't realize that big tech is censoring on behalf of the government.
Oh, I
That's
mean, that's basically what Alex
it's
Berenson has the
right.
receipts
And
for.
he has the receipts for it. It's obvious when Section 230 is not being enforced that there's a collusion going on. Because if they were following the law, if the government was following the law, if they weren't giving this preferential treatment to tech companies, they wouldn't actually, they would actually be enforcing this. They would actually be enforcing Section 230, but they're not enforcing it, which is favorable treatment, which is prima facie evidence of collusion. And David French, obviously anti-Christian nationalist, obviously pro drag queen story hours, the price of freedom, and obviously pro big tech government collusion to censor political speech
No,
is the
as I like to
blessings
say,
of liberty.
businesses are people too. Conservatism, basically,
which is a
corporations over people.
which is a really bad, which honestly the Republican Party had a history of that. That certainly exists longer than it exists that the Republican Party was a strictly conservative party.
That's true.
So, because if you go back, even prior to the Great Depression, or let's say prior to Calvin Coolidge or Warren Harding, the Republican Party was very corporatist. And then it flirted with Teddy Roosevelt, who was kind of like in the middle, very electable in that sense. But anyway, you got the rise of the religious right, which kind of set the wheels for where we're at in motion. And I don't remember if we did a live stream on this or I did a video, but the religious right, the moral majority succeeded. The moral majority got it got Ronald Reagan elected and also sustained him for another 8 years. But we got the judges we got now because of the work started by the moral majority. So that is not a movement to discredit, but it is a movement to expand, renew, reform in order to get it right and better moving forward. So, okay, you got a lot of love for Calvin Coolidge in the chat, but
I mean,
yeah,
the only thing I will, I do got to critique Coolidge on the whole prohibition enforcement thing, but
yeah, that might be
no one's
about it.
perfect.
No one's perfect. So, and Grover Cleveland was the best Democrat. I'm not sure I agree with that because I actually think you got Andrew Jackson, who not only tore down the central banks, and then you got President Polk, who's probably one of the best one-term presidents in American history, who
I
not
mean,
only annexed
Polk.
Texas but also defeated Mexico.
I mean, Polk did
And
everything.
Mexico is so wrecked from Polk and Zachary Taylor, who was the general in that war, future president.
I mean,
Uh,
Polk did everything he set out to do. So I mean,
yeah,
you're batting 1,000 on your agenda.
exactly, and same with Warren Harding, who kept us out of the League of Nations. Uh, so a lot of good one-term presidents out there, actually. But and John Adams gave us a navy. So they would kind of going back to how they define Christian nationalism, they would basically say it's believing in American heritage as Christian, right?
Let
That's a
me
large.
actually kind of break through the excerpt real quick. Christian nationalism asserts that there is something identifiable as an American nation, distinct from other nations. So we have this idea of American exceptionalism boiled in, which again, Paul Miller does not really believe in American exceptionalism. That American nationhood is and should remain defined by Christianity and Christian cultural norms. So, I mean, that
That
one
part
kind
we're
of,
pretty down with.
yeah, that part we're pretty down with, and it pretty much overlaps with what the Democrats think on the issue. That the American people and their government should actively work to defend, sustain, and cultivate America's Christian culture, heritage, and values. So the idea that not only is it America defined by its Christianity and Christian heritage, that also makes it distinct from other nations, but that Americans should support and cultivate or should maintain and preserve this heritage, which kind of makes sense that if
So
you,
it's not only having belief but having conviction.
yes,
So it seems like the area where people most get confused, and I think the definition gets twisted most, is on the belief of American exceptionalism. Because I don't know who's out there saying that America's the new Israel. Because
I mean,
dispensationalism is the most prominent belief system, eschatology in the United States. And they firmly believe that Israel is the Israel. So I don't know who thinks that America's the new Israel other than Mormons, who have a very different creation in Jesus story, because that is your perverted American nationalism mixed with Christianity is Mormonism.
well, I
That's just
mean,
their history. That's why they have to retcon Jesus as walking in North America and preaching to Native Americans or something like that. They have to add that into their Christology, and it just does not exist there.
well, it's weird because it's like, I mean, like when you're taking issues with American exceptionalism, I mean, you're saying one, God didn't raise up and ordain America, which is objectively false. I mean, just read the book of Daniel. The entire point of that book is basically God ordains the rise and fall of nations. God is sovereign over the nations, is the
That's also
primary
true in the
theme.
book of Jeremiah as well.
But we're looking at, I mean, first of all, if you believe in a sovereign God, then you would certainly say that God ordained the rise of America. So basically, but American exceptionalism, I mean, that would also probably encompass things like manifest destiny, which, I kind of talk more about this in base manifesto, but, nations do have the right to expand and grow because as you grow, you consume more resources. So a good nation will sustain itself. But I mean, the idea that America is exceptional, I mean, again, goes back to founded on a creed, founded on a philosophical framework versus a distinct land or distinct heritage. So, I mean, the
Distinct
origin of,
ethnicity might be the
yeah,
most accurate way to put it, because America wasn't
yeah.
founded on a distinct ethnicity. Theoretically, though, if we lasted long enough and kind of had like closed borders, we would become a distinct ethnicity, because that's how ethnicities work. Just a real quick shout out. I want to give a shout out to Phil for the $20 super chat. Thank you very much. That will help out this ministry effort, because we don't take any money from this for ourselves. It goes into the work that we do here. So I just wanted to say that.
And again,
Interesting framework here. I think the Texas Rebellion was a Romans 13 violation and an act of evil. Now, my understanding of this is that a lot of people, and this is just a Tennessee joke, if you're from Tennessee, you've maybe heard it said that Texas is Tennessee's first colony, because a bunch of people went from Tennessee into Texas to kind of reform it and reenact the American Revolution in order to be the people on top.
well, I
Davy
mean, that's just,
Crockett being a very charismatic man with a
I
lot
mean,
of legend around him.
you have two competing cultures there, and one of them is going to succeed. That's pretty much what happened in Texas. You had, not to
I
say the
wish I
white
knew
man
more
America.
about that
Yeah,
to comment on it. Like, I know a lot of history, but I don't know the nuts and bolts of the Texas Rebellion, because I don't live in Texas. But I have seen the movie, but the remake, not even the good one.
but
So
yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but I do know, again, when you have people that had the American tradition and then people that have, I guess, a Mexican or Spanish tradition, they're going to compete at some point in time.
and if I'm ranking top 10 generals in U.S. history, I think Sam Houston would crack the list of top 10 generals in U.S. history. His tactics for defeating Santa Fe and Anna, uh, pretty brilliant given the condition of the Texas Army. So, but that's basically most of what I know is more of the military. I don't know enough about the politics. I don't know enough about the root causes, but I know a lot of it had to do with immigration and demographic terraforming, which is what Americans were doing to Texas. They're demographically terraforming it. So, and I would say that the American Revolution, it's so hard to judge because we have suffered like far more abuses than the colonists did, and we haven't revolted yet. And this is the argument of uh, John MacArthur. I don't know why I'm blanking on that. It's because he kind of repented of this overarching position, but I don't know if his position on this specific historical narrative is true or not. And if they were actively violating Romans 13, it'd be pretty difficult, uh, because the Declaration of Independence invokes God's providence. It calls upon God's providence. And historically, America has been blessed. We are in bad times now, but again, we've lasted over 200 years.
One thing, going,
Most nations don't last this long.
we might actually, not to conflate too much, but we might be the oldest nation or one of the oldest nations on earth. If you think about it, if you're talking about a modern government,
Yeah, I mean, I don't
we
count.
might
Oh,
be,
China's been around since the year 3000 or 3000 BC. No, they've been around since 1947.
yeah. When you look at the modern nations of today, America is what, right behind
England
Britain.
might be the oldest.
Yeah, again, I'm not too familiar with some of the more Eastern
And
European monarchs, but pretty much,
well, Eastern Europe has kind of had a lot of leadership changes when you have
or
the
even
rise and fall.
Scandinavian.
Uh, yeah, you'd have to look more something like a Norway or a Sweden. Maybe a
But I mean,
Denmark.
most other European nations, most African nations, certainly most Asian nations and Middle Eastern nations have all gone through government changes, and we're talking like,
A
top.
significant regime change that would
Yes,
constitute a new nation starting
yeah,
point if you're measuring how long a nation has lasted.
a new
Like
government.
France has been around a long time. They're one of the oldest. I don't want to say cultures because they go back to Charles Martel and stuff like that. They would claim that as their heritage, but again, we had the French Revolution, but that's not the only significant regime government reformation that France has undergone since 1803. Um, so yeah, America has lasted a long time. So I think America was blessed, and I don't think retroactively. I don't think in hindsight, Monday morning quarterbacking us. I don't think we can argue that the results of the American Revolution was a failure. In that it was a failure of not being blessed by God. I think God did bless the results of the revolution.
Well, and the other thing is going back to Manifest Destiny, I mean, I've heard it said America hit the geographic jackpot. Like we have the mega millions of natural resources, waterways, and basically having two oceans on our flanks. So I mean, again, we this nation is uniquely blessed versus all the other nations, just on a geographic standpoint.
Exactly. And if you look at the rise and fall of nations, because I can totally just do like not in every instance, because that'd be just too much of an ethno European view of history. But if you look at the rise and fall of nations, it was always a nation that came out of the park that was just a a slight outsider that was still relevant, but they were an isolated but relevant. That has been the formula for a rising nation throughout the entirety of history. They were just outside of where the action was going on. That's why, like Egypt, kind of peaked in kindergarten as far as world history goes. The Middle East or Iraq, as we know it, Babylonians peaked very early because whoever was just a little bit outside of them was still relevant, could take them over. They had enough isolation. Uh, the Persians were big, but the Macedonians were just on the periphery. They were just isolated enough to grow, nation build, and take them over. And then the Europe and then the British were just isolated by the English Channel enough to go. And then America, we had the whole Atlantic Ocean, but we maintained irrelevance. And then obviously you have some exceptions to this, or not exceptions. This just proves the rule of like sub-Saharan Africa, which was not very relevant because crossing the Sahara Desert was very difficult. And then you had like the Arab slave trade, which definitely was not going to help nations grow on the eastern side of Africa as either. And then you have like the pirate islands of Southeast Asia. So just fascinating history. But let's steer back towards Christian nationalism land. And why are people threatened by this?
Well, I think the threat comes from the fact that there is some potency behind it. I mean, no one's threatened by latest iteration of neoconservatism, which again would be like your Paul Millers, your Russell Moores. No one's threatened by that. I mean, that's
You
why
know
they're
who no one's threatened by?
Liz Cheney.
Well, she actually has a little bit more potency.
I
Mike
am,
Pence.
yeah.
Mike Pence. But you know who David French was praising? Mike Pence. Because he thinks that Mike Pence is the pathway to help. He has enough legitimacy in order to incrementally restore the Republican Party to his neoconservative image. So I just think that's interesting, but there's potency. And I think you're right. The other word is I think that Christian nationalism is just a front for Christian because I think the beliefs of Christian nationalism are in general orthodox and just so ordinary and widely held by Christians that this is just a front
I mean,
because they're going to drop the nationalism label as soon as it becomes
I
politically
mean, keep in
viable.
mind they think
They will drop the nationalist and just say Christian.
like if you go to like the New York Times people, they think the end abortion now types, the ones that actually want to like criminalize the women, things like that, are Christian nationalists. They think and keep in mind, one thing I cite in the article is we're not even talking about reinventing the wheel. We're literally talking about going back like 30, 40, 50 years in public policy, back when, sodomy laws actually existed in the United States, back when, abortion was illegal pre-Roe. Um, and of course, no fault divorce might be one thing that's on there. So it's just like we're not talking about going back or reinventing some new regime. We're not implementing some new experiment. We're literally talking about going back like 50 years, pre-feminism, pre-postmodernism,
Right.
pre-communist march to the institutions.
Yeah, it's like the meme goes, return to tradition. I said return. Perfect. Basically. That and that's kind of where it goes. It's like we're trying to set the clock back on the, United States. And by set the clock back, I mean kind of take certain aspects of our country back to a certain way, kind of reform our country to take it back to where it really should have been. Because if you think about it, if you're to rank your top 10 presidents, how many of them would be out of the first 10 presidents?
I mean, generally, a lot of people would do Washington at
Washington,
first.
Jefferson,
I mean, Lincoln's 14th, but
Monroe,
yeah, Monroe generally would get there. Obviously,
Madison,
yeah, Madison easily. Maybe Adams, maybe. Maybe
Jackson,
maybe
maybe Jackson.
Jefferson.
No, Jefferson's an automatic. I think Jefferson might be America's best president on the basis of the Louisiana Purchase, the Barbary Wars. Uh, he let certain things expire. Like, I think as far as presidents go, he was definitely one of the best presidents we've ever had. Millions for defense, not a penny for tribute. Isn't that him? Or that's his foreign policy. Even though John Adams founded our Navy, I think John Adams at least deserves maybe some credit. I think he's in the upper half of the U.S. presidents.
He's a monarchist, though.
Right, but Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, those three all have like identical resumes almost, because they're all from Virginia. So that's, and then Jackson would be number 7, and then there's Quincy Adams, and then Martin Van Buren, Tippy Canoe, and who only lasted 30 days and did the least amount of he did the least amount of damage to this country out of any president. And then
I mean, if you're looking at who they would say is the worst, they would probably say Buchanan, who might be the earliest on that list
to be considered a worse president.
I mean, Harding gets overly vilified.
But
Carter, and
it's pretty interesting that if we're naming top 10 top 10 presidents in the United States, undoubtedly 4 of the first 5 presidents are automatically on that top 10. Doesn't that say something about the founding of this country and how good the leadership was back then?
Well, yeah,
versus where it went wrong.
Well, it's those people defined America. And if you look, I mean, yeah, Jefferson is probably more. Jefferson's a deist, so they like all the people that hate the whole Christian heritage of America will generally cite Jefferson.
They'll cite Jefferson and Ben Franklin, and is it Thomas Paine or is it?
I believe so.
I can't remember. It was one of the no, it's not John Henry, right? Because he was a Christian, wasn't he? But it's them. But they don't look at the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Many of them had priestly backgrounds.
Or John Adams, or
now John Adams might have been a Unitarian, but even back then, Unitarianism might have meant something slightly different than what it means now. Not that it's orthodox, but I think he might have been a Unitarian. So we might give him too much credit, but even still, the Unitarians, deists, and even Catholics were a very small minority of people who signed the Declaration of Independence. I don't want to say fringe because they weren't fringe, but they were a minority. So when we talk about returning America to a Christian heritage, And you look back at that period in American history, and it was a lot more competently governed consistently.
So I mean, they passed the torch, and then future generations kind of mess it up. I think is part of one of
Right.
the themes, and it's kind of like the Christian nationalism movement embodies the "Make America Great Again" slogan, where the slogan's effective, and you've talked about this before, because it acknowledges that America is in decline, that American greatness is on the downfall, and the tide needs to be reversed. So that's kind of where a lot of the Christian nationalist movement goes to. Again, they're not jingoists. They're not just going to defend America invading countries for no reason, or even defend some of the bad things, or restore, I guess, segregation laws, which were imposed by government, by the way.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. Like we get if you look at the Plessy versus Ferguson case, it was a private company. Wasn't it a private company that wanted to sue?
Private car company, train company that wanted a case to take to the courts, but
Right,
we
and
don't.
they wanted the case because they didn't want to double their cost in order to uphold segregation. Because from a business standpoint, why would you want to double your fixed cost? But the government said you had to.
So I mean, Christian nationalism isn't about returning America to some previous state. It's about returning America to its best form, not its worst, or not
Well,
while
it's kind
while
of like
not acknowledging.
there's a slogan in Protestantism called "Semper Reformanda," always reforming. You're always trying to reform Christian theology, Christian doctrine to its most purest, most biblical state. And that's, why we study theology. That's why we study church history. Because you want the church now to be the best church that it can be. And you want, and the nationalist wants their nation to be the best nation that it could be. Which is why I think nationalism is, again, I said this at the beginning, it's a beta ideology. It means nothing unless it's attached to a different ideology or noun. Like Christian nationalism has meaning. American nationalism has meaning. National socialism has a meaning. It's bad, by the way. But, and then National Socialism, German Workers' Party has a very distinct meaning. But people really like to forget the socialist part of that, because the nationalist part of that was actually the least benign thing. Because if you break that down as socialism, and then a German Workers' Party, which was more of a progressive party, that was more like your left wing. That would have been a left wing party in the United States political spectrum. And then the socialist, which is really left wing, and then it's like national. You're trying to nationalize everything. So nationalism on its own has very little meaning, and that's the point I want to drive home. Christian has meaning. It can get diluted, it can get attacked, but it has meaning, and you can't take that away. So one of the other things I wanted to focus on, because we're still on this kind of section of why do people find it threatening? And you said your first answer was that it was potent, and I think it's also threatening because it attacks specific theologies. So one theology in specific that I think uh, Christian nationalism attacks directly is dispensationalism.
I mean, that's certainly true. And just to kind of go back to the Paul Miller excerpt I quote, American Christians have long merged their religious faith with Christian identity. In the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, Americans regularly described the United States as a new Israel. In the 20th century, as a Christian nation. So basically, he's going back to the founding. And which again, 17th century is the 1600s. Just so there's no confusion. That's pilgrims. That's colonial age. That's
John Weiss,
yeah. I mean, you're
or
going back
John
to
Wise, I should say. Um, just so people don't get confused. But
Like you're going back
where do
to
you think
colonial.
the ideas of free speech and government non-interference in religion and stuff like that, where do you think a lot of these ideas that are in the U.S. Constitution derive from? They derive from pastors living in America generations before the Declaration of Independence or the first U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights, or not the first U.S. because our Constitution was technically the second because of the Articles of Confederation, but nonetheless, way prior to the Bill of Rights, the ideals in the Bill of Rights were preached in the American church. And that's just an undeniable fact because I've read the books. I've read a book written from that era, and the author of that book, the pastor John Wise, literally goes through that. And then, so you can't deny it. And dispensationalism, obviously, the fetishizing of the current nation state of Israel is a direct result of dispensationalism. I think the idea that God has promises for a specific nation, and that specific nation, and I think that's where a lot of people try to say, you think America's the new Israel. It's like, no.
Well, the idea, like this, there's this notion that, oh, because I mean, when I do the John Winthrop reference, he, like in reading the sermon, he references Deuteronomy 30, which is Moses's farewell, which again you see multiple kind of farewell types throughout the Old Testament, where if you follow the law that the Lord has given you, you will do well in the land, you will prosper. If you don't, you will be punished.
I mean,
Uh,
I
like
think
these,
Jacob's farewell was the best farewell in Scripture,
yeah,
other than Jesus's, obviously. But just saying, just acknowledging that Reuben did what he did and calling Dan like the future traitor of the race, like that's a pretty graphic farewell. But
but
uh,
there's like, I mean, it comes down to one, do you have a good understanding of covenant theology, which a lot of the,
dispensationalists inherently disagree with
and if you believe that the church, as in universal church, not
the
Catholic,
Catholic Church, lowercase c.
lowercase c, is the fulfillment of Israel, meaning that the church, the body of believers, the elect, are of course are God's people, then you would automatically understand that a society of said God's people would fulfill the city on a hill, the light that cannot be hidden. So, and that is the ideology that the Puritans came over to America with. This idea that we could be the city on a hill, that we could fulfill we could create a Christian nation or a Christian people. So, where a lot of and again, a lot of these dispensational ideologies come from what 150 years ago. So, as those
They're
ideologies
very new in the whole scheme of Christian history.
and
Very
as
new
those
and very geographically isolated.
and as those ideologies permeate in our society, they've kind of displaced the previous reformed post-mill, um, I guess, backdrop that kind of undergirded the Puritans, the Pilgrims, and a lot of in the First Great Awakening. So you have a lot of the early Christian heritage that was theologically distinct from what majority of modern day evangelicals actually believe. So there's a huge difference in theology. So that's how you get into, oh, they think America's new Israel. But if you believe that the words of the Bible are true and therefore there's wisdom, i- all scripture is useful for reproach, then you would believe that if a nation turns towards God, regardless of whether or not they're the Old Testament Israel, then that they would be blessed. And you even see this with Nineveh, a foreign nation, a pagan nation that turned towards God and was blessed and spared the wrath of God for another 100 years. You probably
Yeah,
might
we
even
don't even
see,
know how. Obviously, we can assume that there was a lot of genuine repentance, but we don't know how long that genuine repentance lasted in Nineveh.
like we
So,
know, maybe even Tyre was blessed. blessed because they, acknowledged God. Obviously, if there was like positive relations between
Right.
them and the Israelites.
And
So I mean,
so, they dispensationalists believe that, the physical nation state of Israel, bless, God will still uphold the promise to this physical nation state of Israel that currently exists today, that he will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And Christian nationalism threatens that because it doesn't recognize the physical nation state of Israel in any sort of theological capacity.
no, again, it acknowledges the covenant theology where the church kind of fulfills Israel, which again, if you take a logical exercise, if you curse the church, then again, you will be cursed later on. And if you bless the church, then you will receive the blessings of said church
On your
flow for
society.
on your
And
society. Like the
this is
Romans,
certainly true in the Dutch history, Dutch Reformed movement
I
in
mean,
the
we see this
Netherlands.
with the Romans as well, where the orphans were being taken care of by the Christians. The Obviously they got rid of the games. A lot of the games, slavery slowly disappears from Europe,
And
even though
you
that
got to recognize how significant of a change that was for Rome to get rid of slavery or uh, in a slave society. If you think the American South was a slave society, you know nothing about Roman history. And I mean that relative. Like when Paul's writing about slavery, he was writing in Rome. That was a very significantly worse system of slavery than ever existed in the United States. And that's in part because of the Christian heritage, also in part because America got out of the worst atrocities of the Atlantic slave trade by ending the slave trade or ending its participation in the slave trade, which was probably the worst factor going on, most
yeah, I
inhumane.
mean, John Newton writing Amazing Grace from having been involved in that, of basically
Right.
treating uh,
That was probably the most evil thing that went on in the American system of slavery was the physical transportation and the mistreatment thereof and the just high casualty rates. In Rome, they still had that. They obviously they had that because of unsanitary conditions and whatnot, but it was very bad. Like obviously because they didn't have the Christian morality on top of it, or any sort of Christian morality undergirding anything in that society. So a lot was more permissible in terms of abuse, in terms of mistreatment, and they had a lot of slave rebellions as a result. So that being said, I think dispensationalism highly threatened by Christian nationalism, and that's why you're seeing a lot of pushback. And I don't know Russell Moore's eschatology.
I would I would assume dispensationalism for most people, unless
It's a safe
otherwise
assumption because
it's
post
like.
mills are the most Christian nationalist.
And that's, I mean, even I watched like today, in prep work, I guess I watched like, what does Doug Wilson say? Because he's, your highly known theonomist. So, and he kind of agrees with it, though he'll probably preface it as I do, where it's a term that was more or less ascribed by the left to describe the right. Um,
But they're
and
not
that
describing anything
basically,
that we disagree with
if you're at,
fundamentally.
yeah, if you're advocating any form of imposing Christian morality upon a society, even as something as basic as like, the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, then you would get the charge of Christian national. That's kind of where he was at.
Okay. And again, I'm all about co-opting terms that they use for our good. Like just to use another example, like evangelical dark web is doing that. The name evangelical dark web did that in itself, as I explained earlier in the stream. Christian nationalist is another way of doing that, but it's like, hey, I like that. But another thing is pro-life movement, because I think the feminists have subverted the pro-life movement so much that I'm just at the point where I'm not going to call those. I'm going to say those people aren't pro-life because they don't actually believe that abortion is murder. If they don't want to punish women for getting an abortion.
But
If
that's
they if
Christian
they think
nationalist belief.
that is a Christian nationalist belief because you believe that women are perpetrators in the event of an abortion, it's like, yes, I don't believe they're victims. Unless they didn't have, if they had agency in the decision, then they weren't a victim because the victim's the dead baby. Like, no, you're not a victim too. You're not dead. But any case, another theology that's highly threatened is radical two kingdoms theology, also known as pietism. And this is a movement born out of Germany and Sweden, two of the belligerents in the 30 Years' War, which was one of the deadliest conflicts in European history. And if you think about it, that was before mass guns and bombs and stuff, but it was you had a major event for Protestants, because it was fought between a lot of Protestants and Catholics, was the sacking of Magdeburg, which was a very significant city in Christian Protestant history, is Magdeburg, Germany. And Magdeburg is a very special city because it stands against pietism and radical two kingdoms theology. The Magdeburg Confession. Scott's saying that the movement was from Sweden. I already hate it. But Sweden and Germany, to be fair. It came out of the Lutheran camp. But Magdeburg, Germany was a very significant city because they upheld a siege against Charles V, who was the most powerful man in Europe at the time. I believe this was 1517 was the year, and they protracted a siege. And in the course of that siege, they came up with a confession called the Magdeburg Confessions, which is a very sectarian Lutheran confession. So I cannot ascribe to the Magdeburg Confession of Faith because it is very anti-Credo Baptist. Like it says that, Credo Baptists are heretics and stuff like that, which is not correct. But nonetheless, it does ascribe the idea of sphere sovereignty. It was one of the first major introductions of the notion of sphere sovereignty. And I believe it distinguished between state, church, family, and self. Those are the four spheres. Sometimes people don't include self, but between self and family, there is a lot of overlap. So anyway, you have that came from the Magdeburg, Germany, and this is a Lutheran movement that specifically was not pietist. And then in the 30 Years' War, the Catholics would specifically sack the city of Magdeburg. They leveled it in retaliation for this protracted siege, which they won. They won the siege, by the way, because Charles V had to withdraw. So, and then obviously you have John Knox in the Scottish Reform movement, and a lot of stuff that went on in English history, which I'm not as expert on as the other esoteric history references that I've made here. And then you have the other side, which was the Germans and the Swedes, which went in the opposite direction. They went more in a let's withdraw from government, two kingdoms, the earthly kingdom and the heavenly kingdom. Never the two shall touch. Only focus on your personal, private pursuit of holiness, and kind of withdraw from the public square. And
Which,
we see the
fruit of that. I mean, those
we see the
nations are
fruit of
all
that 200 years later, 400 years later. Actually, let's say 200 years later, from the 1600s, late 1600s to the mid to late 1800s, where Germany is a largely secular culture by that point. I mean, for the 1800s, Germany was very secular by the late 1800s.
well, and again, during that time, you might have had the Catholic Church might have been usurped, but then you have the state church of the Church of England, and then the church. I mean, I want to say by World War II, the Lutheran Church in Germany was a state-ran church,
I believe the Lutheran Church in
which
Sweden is state-run as well. They have the Church of Sweden.
so a lot of these churches they became subservient to the state, then they became more or less pietist,
Yeah, it's funny how
and that weren't
pietist
really
churches count.
pious.
Yeah, it's like we're pietist, but we're state-run. But you see this in American immigration as well, because I believe Germans were the largest immigrant group. If you want to gene pool people, a lot of it was German. Maybe that's because Anglos and Saxons came from modern day Germany and Denmark, to invade the British Isles. Maybe it's because of that. And when you do a 23andMe, it just comes up as Germany. Maybe that's the reason. But uh, Germans, Swedes, they came to the United States in droves, a lot of them, huge immigrant population, and they brought more pietist theology with them
Well,
as
that's where you
well.
get a lot of the
The
Anabaptists.
And then you also got to include the Evangelical Free Church and the Evangelical Covenant Church, which is apostate, very apostate, I would say. And that,
Rochelle. Oh,
Craig Rochelle being the largest figurehead in that movement. So uh, Scott says that withdrawing from society, looking inward, and becoming aloof weirdos is very Swedish and Nordic. I don't know enough about the stereotypes of those people to comment on that, and he says, look at Minnesota, and Minnesota is a very weird state politically. Like that is one of your there's some pretty easy to explain states. Like Maryland is a very easy to explain state. We're right next to Washington D.C., easy to corrupt, and we rely on government dollars for our economy. So we're not going to vote for small government. Pretty easy to explain. Minnesota, I don't get that one. So going back to the pietist debate, the largest figurehead of pietism would have probably been John MacArthur.
in the United States.
Yes.
Well, I know when I guess Joel Webben and Megan Basham did a sit down. It's like, okay, is this guy progressive? Is he a pietist, or I forget what they called the good person, but a perseverance or whatever, persevere. But they had John MacArthur as kind of like pietist, but moving towards the good type, and that would be more of a recent change. They
And
totally
that
labeled
is
John
and
Piper as pietist.
that's where pietism is, or radical two kingdoms theology, if you want to be more specific, is threatened by this idea of Christian nationalism. So, it's not when there's infighting in evangelicalism, it's usually about the doctrine. And usually the doctrine's feminism. Like the people that are going after Mark Driscoll don't really care about the way he runs his church with accountability. They hate him for two reasons. One, he kept his church open during lockdown. So that, to my knowledge, he did not shut his church down or impose a mask mandate. And two, he's not a feminist that I know of. So, but those are the two reasons they go after him. It's not because they care about, he doesn't, he's not held accountable by his church elders. Well,
Or he's
is your
spying on
church?
church members, or
I don't know. I don't know if that even factors in, but it's mainly because of those two reasons. And obviously, with the whole sex abuse in the Southern Baptist Convention, the disagreement isn't about the sex abuse. It's about whether to introduce feminism as a theology, whether to incorporate Rachel Denhollander's theology into the Southern Baptist Convention. That's really the actual debate here. And that's why you're seeing a lot of people fold. And then when people go after John MacArthur, like Julie Roys, she goes after John MacArthur because she is a feminist. It's about her theology and his theology clashing. It's not about, his congregation gave him an expensive watch that was worth $100 for every year that he worked for the church, so $5,000 watch, as a token gift for his service to that church, which I had no issues with. Or that over the course of 50 years in ministry and living in the same house or whatever, he has houses. He might have bought a vacation home or whatever in a different state, and those houses are worth over $2 million or something like that. After decades of inflation. Like, these are illegitimate criticisms, but these criticisms exist because Julie Roys is a feminist. That's why they
yeah, I mean,
exist.
they're not gonna criticize premill dispensationalism,
And
or they're not even gonna do, oh, he's Calvinist, so I don't like him.
and likewise, if the people come after, say, Andrew Torba or even myself for siding with Christian nationalism, it's going to be because they disagree with me theologically because they're pietist or they're dispensationalist.
I don't
And
know.
I think
Torba
those are
might
the
be,
two biggies.
Torba might be a little different, a little bit more. I mean,
Torba is because he's so post-mill that he's so anti-dispensationalist that he totally and he intentionally tries to piss off the right people.
he likes
He's
he
so
likes
above
being
board
enlightening.
about what he is and what he's trying to do. He's very above board about that, and they can't stand that because Andrew Torba is trying to make what the country thinks is a fringe. He's trying to use social media to take, going back to what I said very beginning of the stream. He's using social media to take what is widely perceived to be a fringe belief and convince people that it's far more widely held than people would previously consider it to be.
Well, I guess with Torba, because I've thought about writing the article on that. It's just like, I
One
feel
of
like
these days, I want to bring him on for a live stream.
I feel like he only has one speed though. There's only one mode, and that's like super hard. Like there's no soft, there's no curveball. It's only fastballs down the middle.
Yeah, yeah, and
Like
I'm
it's
not a post
110% every time.
millennialist just because I'm not convinced on the merits of the theology yet. If you want to convince me on the merits of post millennialism, I'll be happy to hear it. But I'm not convinced on the merits of Scripture. But I love the application that post millennialists have.
No, I'm flirting hard with it.
And I'm flirting hard with it because I agree with their applications so much. And I agree with the fruit as well. But radical two kingdoms theology, typically more associated with amillennialism, obviously, in the case of John MacArthur, can be associated with dispensational premillennialism and that eschatology. But but obviously, those theologies are threatened by Christian nationalism. And at the end of the day, Korean babes, you're post mill. I didn't know that. I don't. Again, because post mill, they consider themselves in between historic premillennialism and amillennialism. I don't know if I agree with that or not, because I think historic amillennialism or historic premillennialism and amillennialism are very similar. So I'm not. So I'm like trying to think what's the actual difference, because I think the biggest difference between those two is like the concept of an antichrist. I think that's the biggest difference between those two. I could be wrong. And yes, Connor is asking a question. Yes, the stream will remain on the channel. I know a lot of YouTube channels remove their streams after they stream, but yeah, we don't do that here because I only got one channel. Torba is based. Give him a trebuchet, and he would lay siege to Philadelphia.
Like I said, only one speed.
Only one speed. But yeah,
that's his greatest weapon is also his greatest weakness.
Send in your comments or questions below. We're gonna do a last call, but again, a number of things. Let's just kind of talk ballpark politicians that are rising right now in terms of Christian nationalism. And I think that's where we'll end off, because we can do a stream on 2024 politics a different day. But let's talk, 2022 politics. Doug Mastriano would probably be the biggest epitome of Christian nationalism, and I think he's going to win that election in Pennsylvania.
I hope. He's got Oz.
Oz could be a ballot drag for sure, but in some ways they could end up helping each other. Carrie Lake.
I'm not sure I've heard anything on Christianity from her.
I don't know what her faith profile is.
So that would be...
She's more America first, but nonetheless, the Christian nationalist movement will embrace her.
That is true.
Ron DeSantis.
I think he's Catholic theologically. So he comes from more of a Catholic background. So I would remain him probably in the America First category for right now.
J.D. Vance.
It's weird because J.D. Vance is actually Catholic too. He grew up Protestant. He converted to Catholic. I surprisingly did not write that in my article on JD Vance, but that is his theological leanings.
I find that
Um,
I find that Catholics or Protestants who convert to Catholicism fetishize Catholic tradition and
and
Catholic history.
and that might
It
be
search
part
for
of it.
tradition as a form of meaning.
That might be part of it, and why, like, again, part of why I actually think his transformation is genuine, or at least you should bank on JD Vance for right now. Um, so that's my vote of confidence in him, is that he has had a more of a theological conversion, not just a I'm Trump now kind of guy.
Okay. How about Blake Masters running for Senate in Arizona? I really should say who these people are and what they're running for, but I feel like a lot
I
of
want to
people
say yes,
that's
but I'm not.
feel
I'm
like it's
not
public.
too familiar on Blake Masters, but he did punch a pedophile, which kind of works in his favor.
That does work in his favor. Uh, yeah, prostate trad cath fetishize. Yeah, it's a history that they're fetishizing, and it's not even a correct history because Catholicism does not have uh, an unbroken lineage between Saint Peter and Pope Francis, whatever number he is.
Well, you gotta.
There's not an unbroken lineage. We have the
He's either.
Avignon Pope, and that's just being, and that's just not even where you get from Peter to a second Pope. So it's just such a broken history. But keep in mind, that's where we get a lot of like what happened to the 12 apostles after after Jesus left them. We get that from the Catholic Church. So hopefully they're right about some things. But Mark Robertson, Lieutenant Governor of North Carolina.
Oh, that's Christian nationalism
That's
all the
Christian
way.
nationalist there. He's based. He'd probably be the most based currently elected official in the country right now.
Yeah, if only he had actual authority.
Yes. But he says he's going to run for governor of North Carolina, so that would be very fascinating.
Yeah, I mean that's an expectation, and 2020 that'd be 2024, so that should bode favorably for him.
Ted Cruz, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas.
I'll say neither. A hard neither.
A hard neither. I don't get it, but I don't get what's happened to him. I just he's from what I've heard, he's the type that reads the enemy media, and I think that affects his instincts and maybe worldview are good, but where he gets his information is terrible. So that's why he's such a weak senator on most issues. And he's just kind of a normie con. Not even America first, not a Christian nationalist, kind of just a normie con.
Yeah, he might be like a top 10 senator, but that's not saying anything.
I mean, he might be top 5, but if, these people you just mentioned get elected to the U.S. Senate, he won't be top 5 anymore. I'm trying to think any other. I don't know I don't know how many other major candidates or earth-shattering candidates there are.
I mean, obviously, if we just look at Maryland with like a Dan Cox.
Dan Cox is a Christian nationalist.
Yeah, that he would kind of fall under that Doug Mastriano banner.
So this is a growing political movement, and I think there's clear viability that we have won primaries, and the national election environment is very favorable to the Republican Party that could carry a lot of these people across the finish line, where in other elections they might not. In Arizona, I think especially, and I don't buy polling right now because you shouldn't buy polling right now. Polling consistently favors the Democrats.
I want to say the betting markets have Kerry Lake as a favorite.
Okay, well, I certainly hope that's true. I certainly hope Blake Masters can get in over astronaut Mark Kelly, and obviously we need another 4 years of Ron DeSantis because I think he could be president one day. So I don't know how much left we have to talk about. Doesn't look like we got any more questions other than about the Cruz take that you just had. And I would probably agree with it because he's just such a normie con. So, oh, wait, we got one last question in the queue. What is the most useful activity a normal, trendy Christian nationalist can do today. Get on the school board, run for local city planner. It
I mean,
depends.
those are all useful ideas. I mean,
I mean, the problem is he said today, so I'm literally taking this August 18th, 2022.
yeah,
And most primaries and most elections of this matter have already passed. So you'd have to wait like 2 or 4 years in most cases to get on this bandwagon. So as far as activity today, because I don't want to just say run for school board. Well, it's kind of too late right now, isn't it? In most places. So obviously there's a lot of political campaigns you can get involved in now. Because I think, the die is cast for who's going to be on the ballot in November. In every state except, say, Florida, where they're going to have their primary. But it's probably still too late to announce a candidacy. And then Florida and New York, I believe, are the 2 states that have primaries left, right? And
I
then
mean,
New Hampshire as well.
I think there's several, but those might be the majors.
Right. So there's still plenty of ways to get involved in the 2022 election from now until November 8th or whatever it is. So look for ways to do that. Volunteer on campaigns, because again, the die is already cast on who's going to be the ballot and on either the primary or the general election. It's too late to say I'm going to run. Maybe next time. Going to meetings doesn't hurt. I don't have kids in public school, but I went to a couple school board meetings that were particularly contentious. And I spoke at one of them about how Harvey Milk was a pedophile. I dropped that line in a speech at a local school board meeting against having pride flags in classrooms. So you can do that. Maybe I'll find the public footage of that one day. But
You could be like an Alex Stein,
hey,
Primetime 99, just
prime
like
time 99, just go to these meetings, perhaps. Because there is a saying that the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and the people that complain get the grease. And I think that happens with a lot of local government stuff. If you show up at the meetings, they'll actually listen to you because you actually care and you raise a stink to their face about it. Rather than pure politics, maybe it's doing stuff like building your network now, meeting people at church in your community, getting people on your side, etc. And I think, yes, that is true. Obviously, there is an election mode right now. There's like an on season and an off season. So you kind of got to think about it like sports sometimes because we're in the middle of the season. But that's just one thing for a Christian nationalist to do politically, obviously. And again, get your church to leave the Southern Baptist Convention will help.
yeah.
Educating your children via homeschooling or some other means than government schools will help. There's a lot of things that you can do.
I mean, right
Starting
now I
your
want
own
to
business
say
and diversifying your income streams is
there's
something you can
what
do.
2 million fewer kids in public schools since COVID. So I mean,
That's
there's a
huge.
huge trend
And
in
I
that
think
direction. Also, have babies. Nothing wrong with
make babies.
repopulating the earth.
Make babies.
Uh, because
Biggest
one of
thing
the
you can
ways
do.
you make a Christian nation, believe it or not, is
Demographic
procreation.
demographic terraforming. Maybe move to Moscow, Idaho, and give them reinforcements. I don't know.
Because
So
I mean, that's one of the things the Puritans were known for is procreation and
yeah,
progeny.
yeah, exactly. So, and when you look at the whole COVID thing and the lockdowns, that has really instigated Christian nationalism because that got a lot of people thinking about how Christians need to actually stand up for beliefs and orthodoxy or orthopraxis in the public square. And that changed John MacArthur's mind. We brought him up in the stream a lot. That changed his mind. And it just showed how pathetic pietism was when applied in the real world. So you can't have radical two kingdom theology. It just won't work. And the idea that the church thrives under persecution isn't necessarily true. the church at large will thrive regardless. God's kingdom advances. But to say that you individually will do so much more under the threat of persecution, in America, we weren't even willing to suffer an ounce of persecution during lockdowns as a whole. Like, obviously,
Yeah.
you just wrote the article about Calvary Church San Jose, which won their lawsuit against California.
Yeah, one of them. And
So there's a lot of exceptions, but that's a general rule of what I'm saying. So anyway, I think that's really all we got for tonight. Make sure you like the stream, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done that already. And if you want to support Evangelical Dark Web, evangelicaldarkweb.org/join is where you can go to do it. Otherwise, subscribe to the newsletter of Evangelical Dark Web. Should be pretty easy enough. Have a blessed day, and I will catch you on the next one.